The medical pod hummed with a soft blue glow as 12-year-old Danny Crawford pressed his small hand against the transparent barrier separating him from his father. And Captain Richard Crawford lay inside the healing chamber with tubes and wires connected to his body while alien technology tried desperately to save his life. Princess Leanna stood beside the boy with her silver eyes reflecting the pod's light, and her pointed ears twitched slightly as she listened to the medical readings that continued to worsen. And behind her, the two dragons remained perfectly still as if they understood the gravity of this moment. And Ember's crimson scales had dimmed to a darker shade while Frost's ice-blue body seemed to absorb all warmth from the surrounding air. The Celestari Palace rose high above the crystal plains of their homeworld, and its towers reached toward 3 moons that hung in the purple sky, and inside these ancient walls countless beings from across the galaxy had sought the legendary healing powers of the elf princess and her dragon companions, but not all who came here could be saved. Danny had arrived on Celestara 3 weeks earlier when his father's ship had barely managed to land at the royal spaceport, and Richard Crawford had collapsed on the landing pad while his young son screamed for help, and the palace guards had rushed them both to the medical wing where Princess Leanna herself had come to examine the dying human. The illness eating away at Richard's body was something human doctors had never seen before, and it had started as a simple fever during a trading mission to the outer colonies, but within months it had spread through his entire system, and by the time they reached Celestara, the captain could barely stand without assistance. Leanna had immediately begun treatment using techniques passed down through generations of Celestari healers, and she had mixed rare herbs from her private gardens with crystallized dragon essence, and she had sung ancient songs that were supposed to strengthen life force, but nothing had worked and the illness continued its relentless advance. Ember and Frost had offered their own contribution to the healing process, and both dragons had allowed drops of their blood to be added to the treatment mixture, which was an incredibly rare gift that most beings would never receive in 1,000 lifetimes. But even dragon blood could not stop what had already progressed too far. Danny spent every waking moment beside his father's pod, and he slept on the floor of the medical chamber because he refused to leave, and the palace staff brought him food that he barely touched, and Princess Leanna visited several times each day to check on both the patient and his devoted son. During one of these visits, Leanna had sat down beside Danny on the cold floor, and she had asked him about his life aboard his father's trading vessel, and Danny had told her stories about visiting different planets and meeting alien species and learning to navigate through asteroid fields, and his eyes had lit up when he described the freedom of space travel. The princess had listened carefully to every word, and she noticed how the boy spoke with wisdom beyond his years, and he understood the value of honest trade and fair dealings because his father had taught him well, and she saw kindness in his young face, even as grief threatened to overwhelm him. Ember had crawled closer to Danny during that conversation, and the dragon had rested her warm head on the boy's lap, offering comfort in the way dragons do, and Danny had stroked her scales without fear, while tears rolled down his cheeks, and Frost had hummed a low melody that seemed to ease some of the pain in the room. Now, as the medical readings grew worse, Richard Crawford opened his eyes inside the pod, and he looked at his son with a gaze that held both love and terrible sadness, and the captain raised one weak hand and pressed it against the barrier from his side, matching his son's small palm princess. Leanna stepped forward and spoke in her melodic voice that carried authority, mixed with compassion, and she told Richard that she needed to speak with him privately about important matters. And Danny started to protest, but his father nodded and asked him to wait outside for just a few minutes. The boy left reluctantly, with his shoulders shaking from silent sobs, and Ember followed him into the corridor to keep him company, while Frost remained beside the princess, and her massive form seemed to fill half the chamber. Leanna opened a small panel in the medical pod that allowed direct communication, and Richard Crawford's voice came through, weak but clear, and he told the princess that he knew his time was ending and he had accepted this truth days ago. What he needed now was someone he could trust with his son's future, and Richard had built a substantial fortune over 20 years of successful trading, and he owned 3 cargo ships and had investments in mining operations on 4 different worlds, and he had saved credits worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. But Danny was too young to inherit such wealth, and without proper guidance the boy could be exploited by those who would steal everything Richard had worked to build and corrupt officials would claim taxes that were not owed, and business partners would challenge contracts, and unscrupulous relatives would appear claiming family rights. Richard looked directly at Princess Lyanna and asked if she would accept guardianship of his fortune, until Danny returned as a man, and not just any man, but someone worthy of the Crawford name, and someone who understood that wealth carried responsibility, and someone who would use resources to help others rather than simply accumulate more. The princess felt the weight of this request, and among her people a promise given to the dying was considered sacred beyond any written contract, and to accept would mean binding herself to this task for however many years it took, and to refuse would be easier, but would leave a young boy vulnerable in a dangerous galaxy. Frost moved closer and pressed her large head against Lyanna's side, offering support, and the dragon's ancient wisdom flowed through their mental bond, and Lyanna understood that this moment would change the course of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. She told Richard that she would accept his request on certain conditions, and the fortune would be held in the royal vaults and managed according to Celestari law. And when Danny returned, she would judge whether he had become the man his father hoped he would be, and only then would the wealth be released. Richard smiled despite his pain, and he said that was exactly what he wanted, and he trusted her judgment completely, and then he asked for one more favor, and he wanted to see his son one final time, to say goodbye. Lyanna called Danny back into the chamber, and father and son had their last conversation through the barrier of the medical pod, and Richard told Danny that he loved him more than all the stars in the galaxy, and he made his son promise to leave Celestar and build his own life and learn about the universe and become strong and honorable. Danny begged his father not to leave him, but Richard insisted, and he said that one day when Danny had grown into a man he should return to Celestara, and Princess Lyanna would be waiting, and she would have something important to give him, but only if he proved himself worthy. The boy did not understand, but he promised, through his tears, and Richard Crawford closed his eyes for the last time, while his son pressed both hands against the pod and screamed for him to wake up. Captain Richard Crawford died as 3 moons rose over Celestara, and Princess Lyanna stood beside a devastated 12-year-old boy, while 2 dragons hummed their morning song, and somewhere in the depths of the eye, palace of vault sealed itself containing a fortune that would wait for the day its true owner returned. 3 days after his father's funeral, Danny Crawford stood in the main hangar of Celestara's royal spaceport, staring at the old cargo ship that was now his only possession, and the vessel looked worn and battered from years of hard use, and its hull bore scorch marks from atmospheric entries and small dents from debris strikes. But the engines were solid, and the navigation systems still worked. Princess Lyanna had arranged for supplies to be loaded onto the ship along with enough credits to reach the nearest human settlement, and she had also provided coordinates for safe routes through the surrounding star systems and locations where a young trader might find honest work. But beyond that, Danny would be on his own. The princess stood at the hangar entrance with both dragons flanking her, and Ember's scales caught the morning light while Frost's massive form cast long shadows across the deck, and Lyanna wore formal robes that marked her royal status, and her expression remained calm, though her silver eyes held something that might have been concern. Danny had spent the past 3 days in a guest chamber of the palace, and he had cried until no more tears would come, and he had raged against the universe for taking his father, and he had finally accepted that nothing would bring Richard Crawford back, and now he had to figure out how to survive alone in a galaxy that did not care about orphaned human boys. The princess had visited him each evening, and she had brought food and sat quietly while he ate, and sometimes she spoke about the nature of grief and loss and how even the longest-lived species like the Celestari had to face the death of those they loved, and sometimes she simply sat in silence while Ember curled up beside Danny, providing warmth. During one of these visits, Danny had asked Lyanna why his father had given her control of the family fortune, and the princess had explained gently that Richard wanted to protect him, and without proper management, the wealth would attract dangerous attention, and people would try to take advantage of a child who suddenly had access to substantial credits. She had told him that when he returned as a man, she would evaluate whether he had grown into someone worthy of his father's legacy, and Danny had not fully understood what that meant, but he had nodded and accepted her words because he trusted her, now as he prepared to leave Celestara forever. Danny felt a strange mixture of fear and determination, and he was terrified of facing the universe alone. But he also felt angry enough at the world to want to prove he could survive. And his father had taught him the basics of trading and navigation and ship maintenance, and those skills would have to be enough. Princess Leanna walked across the hangar deck until she stood directly in front of the young human, and she was taller than him by several inches, and her presence commanded respect, but her voice remained gentle when she spoke. She told Danny that the path ahead would be difficult and he would face challenges that seemed impossible, and he would make mistakes and suffer losses, and there would be times when giving up seemed like the only option, but if he stayed true to the values his father had taught him, then one day he would return to Celestara with his head held high. Danny asked how long he should stay away, and Leanna said that only he would know when the time was right and he should not return seeking the fortune, but rather seeking her judgment on whether he had become the man his father hoped he would be. Ember moved forward and pressed her warm snout against Danny's chest, and the dragon made a soft, chirping sound that expressed affection and farewell, and Danny wrapped his arms around her neck and buried his face in her crimson scales, and when he pulled back his eyes were wet, but he was not crying. Frost approached next and lowered her massive head so that she was eye level with the boy, and the ice dragon's breath came out in cold puffs that formed small crystals in the air, and she touched her nose to Danny's forehead, in what the Celestari considered a blessing, and the boy felt a strange tingling sensation spread through his body. Princess reached into her robes and pulled out a small crystal pendant hanging on a silver chain, and she placed it around Danny's neck and told him that this was a Celestari communication stone, and if he ever faced a situation where death seemed certain, he could activate the stone and send a message to her, and she would hear it no matter where in the galaxy he was. Danny touched the crystal and asked if he should use it to let her know how he was doing, and Leanna shook her head and said the stone was only for true emergencies, and she would know how he was doing through other means, and her network of information gatherers spread across countless worlds, and she would be watching his progress. The boy wanted to ask more questions, but he knew it was time to go, and he straightened his shoulders and tried to look braver than he felt, and he thanked Princess Leanna for everything she had done for him and his father, and he promised that he would return one day. Leanna placed one hand on his shoulder and told him to remember that wealth and success meant nothing if they came at the cost of honor, and his father had been a man of integrity, and that was worth more than all the credits in the galaxy. Danny nodded and turned toward his ship, and he climbed the loading ramp without looking back, because he knew if he saw the princess and her dragons one more time, he might not have the courage to leave. And the ramp closed behind him, and the ship's systems came to life, with familiar sounds that reminded him of his father. Inside the cockpit, Danny ran through the pre-flight checklist that Richard had made him memorize, and his hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, and the engines warmed up and the landing gear retracted, and slowly the old cargo ship lifted off the hangar deck. Through the front viewport, Danny could see Princess Leanna standing with both dragons, and Ember had risen on her back legs and was waving one clawed foot, and Frost's ice blue scales were glowing brighter than usual, and the princess raised one hand in farewell. The ship climbed higher into Celestara's purple sky, and Danny guided it through the atmospheric layers until stars became visible, and the 3 moons of the planet appeared like silver guardians watching over their world, and he set the navigation computer for the nearest trade station and engaged the faster-than-light drive. As Celestara disappeared behind him, Danny Crawford made a silent promise to his father's memory, and he would survive, and he would learn, and he would build something meaningful, and one day he would return to face Princess Leanna's judgment, and he would prove that Richard Crawford's son was worthy of the family name. Princess Leanna stood in the empty hangar long after the ship had vanished, and Ember leaned against her side while Frost's tail wrapped protectively around them both. And the princess wondered if she would ever see the human boy again, and whether he would succeed or fail in the trials ahead. She returned to the palace and descended into the vault levels deep beneath the crystal towers, and inside a secure chamber sat the sealed containers holding Richard Crawford's fortune, and Leanna placed her hand on the lock and felt it recognize her biosignature, and the vault remained closed, waiting for the day its true owner would return. 14 years stretched ahead like an endless road, and the princess had no way of knowing if Danny would survive even the First year alone in space, and so many things could go wrong, and pirates could attack his ship, and corrupt officials could imprison him, and simple bad luck could leave him stranded and dying on some forgotten world. But something in her ancient heart told her that the boy would survive, and more than that, he would thrive. And the universe had a way of testing those destined for greatness. And Danny Crawford carried his father's strength and honor, and perhaps that would be enough. Ember and Frost shared a look that only dragons could understand, and they had lived for centuries and witnessed countless humans come and go. But something about this particular human boy had touched them, and they would wait alongside their princess for his return. 7 years had passed since Danny Crawford left Celestara, and the young man who now commanded a small fleet of 3 trading vessels bore little resemblance to the crying boy who had departed in his father's old ship, and his shoulders had broadened from years of loading cargo, and his hands were calloused from equipment repairs, and his eyes held the confident gaze of someone who had faced the universe and survived. Princess Leanna sat in her private study, surrounded by reports from her information network, and the documents spread across her crystal desk told the story of Danny's journey through the galaxy. And some reports made her smile, while others caused her silver eyes to narrow with concern, and beside her Ember dozed on a cushion while Frost perched on the balcony watching the stars. The first year after Danny left had been brutal, according to the reports, and the young trader had barely survived, and his father's old ship had broken down 3 times in 6 months, and each repair had cost credits he could not afford, and he had taken jobs transporting cargo that more experienced traders refused because the routes were too dangerous or the profit margins too thin. One report described how Danny had been cheated by a Vortan merchant who had paid him in counterfeit credits, and the boy had discovered the fraud only after he had already spent half the payment on fuel and supplies, and he had tracked down the Vortan and demanded real payment. But the merchant had laughed and called station security, claiming the human was harassing him. Danny had been forced to leave that station with almost nothing, and he had survived the next 2 weeks on emergency rations while searching desperately for legitimate work. And Princess Leanna had read that report and felt her chest tighten with worry, and she had almost activated her own communication network to send him assistance. But she had stopped herself because Richard Crawford had wanted his son to learn through struggle. The second year had shown improvement, and Danny had established a reputation for reliable deliveries even on difficult routes, and he transported medical supplies to colony worlds and carried mining equipment to asteroid stations and moved agricultural products between farming planets, and his rates were fair, and his delivery times were consistent. But then came the incident on Tarko Station that had tested Danny's character in ways his father could never have anticipated. And according to Leanna's spies, a local crime syndicate had approached Danny with an offer to transport weapons to a rebel group, and the payment would have been enough to buy a second ship and expand his operation significantly. Danny had refused, and the crime boss had not taken rejection well, and thugs had sabotaged Danny's ship while it was docked, and they had damaged the main engine and slashed the landing gear hydraulics, and poured acid on the hull plating, and the repairs had cost every credit Danny had saved over 2 years. The princess had read that report 3 times, and each time she felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. And Danny had chosen honor over profit, exactly as his father would have wanted. But the choice had nearly destroyed him financially, and for 6 months after Tarko Station, he had struggled to rebuild. Year 3 brought an unexpected partnership, and Danny had met an older trader named Carl Hayes, who recognized quality in the young man, and Carl owned 2 cargo ships and needed someone trustworthy to captain one of them while he ran the other, and he offered Danny a fair contract with profit sharing. Instead of just wages, working with Carl had taught Danny the more sophisticated aspects of trading, and he learned how to negotiate better deals and identify market trends and build relationships with suppliers and station masters. And within 18 months, Danny had saved enough to buy his own second ship, and he had hired a small crew and expanded his operations. Princess Leanna had received detailed reports about the crew Danny selected, and he had chosen carefully, and there was a Zentari engineer who had been blacklisted by major shipping companies for refusing to falsify safety reports, and a human pilot who had lost her previous position after reporting her captain's smuggling activities, and a young Kaldorian who needed work to support his family back home. Each crew member had a story of choosing integrity over convenience, and Danny seemed to recognize kindred spirits, and together they built a reputation as traders who could be trusted, and stations began offering them premium contracts and merchants sought them out specifically. Year 5 brought the incident that made Danny's name known across multiple sectors, and a plague had broken out on the mining colony of Viridian 4, and the colonial government had called for emergency medical supplies. But the planet was located deep in contested space where 3 different factions claimed territorial rights. Most trading companies had refused the contract because the risk was too high, and ships traveling to Viridian 4 would need to pass through areas where pirates operated freely. And even if they survived the journey, the colonial government might not be able to pay the full amount. Danny had accepted the contract, and he had loaded his 2 ships with medical supplies and vaccines and treatment equipment, and he had plotted a route that minimized exposure to the most dangerous zones and convinced Carl Hayes to provide escort with his vessel. The journey had taken 12 days, and they had encountered pirates twice, and the first group had attacked but retreated when they realized the cargo was medical supplies, and even pirates had some standards, and the second group had demanded payment for safe passage, and Danny had negotiated a reasonable fee. When they arrived at Viridian 4, the situation was worse than reported, and thousands of colonists were sick, and dozens were dying each day, and the local hospitals were overwhelmed, and Danny and his crew had worked alongside medical staff to distribute supplies and set up treatment centers, and they had stayed for 3 weeks helping with the relief effort. The colonial government could only pay half the contracted amount, and Danny had accepted without complaint, and when his crew had protested, he had told them that saving lives was worth more than credits, and besides, they had gained something more valuable than money, and they had gained a reputation that would open doors across the galaxy. Princess Lyanna had received multiple reports about Viridian 4 from different sources, and all of them praised Danny's actions, and several mentioned that he reminded people of his father, and the Celestary princess had sat in her study with tears in her silver eyes, while Ember nuzzled her hand and Frost hummed approval. Year 6 brought expansion, and Danny's reputation had spread far enough that established trading companies began offering partnerships, and he acquired a 3rd ship and hired more crew, and established regular routes between major trade hubs, and he was no longer struggling to survive but building something substantial. But success had not changed his core values according to the reports, and Danny still took unprofitable contracts if they helped people who needed supplies, and he paid his crew above standard rates and treated them fairly, and he refused to transport anything that might be used to harm innocent people regardless of the profit involved. There had been one incident where a wealthy merchant had offered Danny a fortune to transport luxury goods through a blockaded system, and the blockade had been established to prevent weapons from reaching a war zone. But luxury goods were technically legal, and many traders had been making significant profits on such runs. Danny had investigated further and discovered that the so-called luxury goods were often inspected loosely, and other traders had been hiding weapon components inside legitimate cargo, and he had refused the contract and reported his suspicions to the sector patrol, and his actions had led to the arrest of several smugglers. That decision had cost him business, and several merchants had stopped offering him contracts, and there had been quiet threats from those involved in the smuggling network. And Danny's ships had been denied docking privileges at certain stations, and for several months, his income had dropped significantly. But Princess Lyanna had noticed something interesting in the reports from that period, and new clients had approached Danny, and these were legitimate businesses and government agencies and charitable organizations who wanted a trader they could trust completely, and slowly, his business had recovered and grown stronger than before. Now in Year 7, Danny Crawford commanded 3 ships and employed 15 crew members, and had established trade routes spanning 6 sectors, and his personal wealth was modest compared to major trading corporations, but substantial for an independent operator, and more importantly, his reputation was unmatched. Princess Lyanna set down the latest report and looked out at the stars beyond her balcony, and Frost turned her massive head, and their eyes met in silent communication, and the dragon's thoughts flowed into the princess's mind, expressing approval and anticipation. 7 more years remained before the 14-year mark that Lyanna had set in her own mind as a reasonable period of growth, and But already she could see that Richard Crawford's son was becoming the man his father had hoped he would be. 14 years to the day after leaving Telestara, Danny Crawford stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the purple planet that had haunted his dreams for over a decade, and the 3 silver moons hung in perfect alignment, just as he remembered, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the control console. His second-in-command stood beside him, and Lieutenant Kate Morrison had served with Danny for 6 years, and she knew him well enough to recognize the unusual nervousness in his posture, and she asked quietly if he was certain about this visit, and Danny nodded but did not speak, because he was not sure he could trust his voice. The journey to Celestara had taken 3 weeks of travel through familiar trade routes, and Danny had used the time to review everything he had accomplished since leaving, and he had built a fleet of 8 ships and employed over 40 crew members and established trade relationships spanning 12 sectors, and his personal wealth was substantial, though not extraordinary. But wealth and success were not what made him nervous, and Princess Liana had told him 14 years ago that she would judge whether he had become worthy of his father's legacy, and Danny had spent every one of those years trying to figure out what that meant, and now he would finally learn if he had succeeded or failed. His crew had noticed their captain's unusual mood, and they had asked questions about why they were visiting Celestara, and Danny had told them only that he had business with the royal family, and some of the older crew members had heard rumors about the elf princess and her dragon companions. But none of them knew the full story. Kate Morrison had pressed harder for information, and Danny had finally told her an abbreviated version, and he had explained about his father's death and the fortune held in trust and the promise to return when he had proven himself, and Kate had listened quietly, and then told him that any princess with sense would see that he had become a man of honor. Danny appreciated her confidence, but he was not so sure, and he had made mistakes over the years, and there had been the incident on Helios Station where he had trusted the wrong business partner and lost an entire cargo to fraud, and the disaster on Cromac where his poor navigation had led to a ship collision that injured 3 crew members and dozens of other failures, large and small. He had also made decisions that others considered foolish, and turning down profitable contracts because they felt wrong, and spending credits to help stranded travelers instead of maximizing profit, and refusing to participate in legal but morally questionable business practices. And these choices had cost him opportunities and enemies. The communication panel beeped and a voice came through in melodic tones that identified the speaker as Celestari, and the traffic controller welcomed them and provided landing coordinates at the Royal Spaceport. And Danny acknowledged and guided his ship toward the planet's surface. As they descended through the atmosphere, the crystal towers of the palace became visible, and they rose impossibly high and caught the light of 3 moons and reflected it in patterns that seemed almost alive. And Danny felt his chest tighten with memories of standing in those towers as a 12-year-old boy watching his father die. The landing was smooth, and the spaceport looked exactly as Danny remembered, though, perhaps more crowded with ships from across the galaxy, and palace guards in ceremonial armor waited at the landing pad, and they approached as soon as the ship powered down. Danny met them at the cargo ramp, and the lead guard was a tall Celestari with the characteristic pointed ears and silver eyes, and he bowed slightly and said that Princess Liana had been expecting Captain Crawford's arrival, and she requested his presence in the throne room at his earliest convenience. Kate Morrison offered to accompany him, but Danny shook his head and told her to make sure the crew stayed with the ship, and he would return when his business was concluded, and his second-in-command looked worried, but she nodded and wished him luck. The walk to the throne room took 15 minutes through corridors Danny barely remembered, and the palace seemed both familiar and strange, like a place from a half-forgotten dream. And servants moved through the halls efficiently, and visiting dignitaries from various species discussed trade agreements and diplomatic matters. Finally, the guard stopped before massive doors carved with images of dragons and stars, and one guard announced Captain Danny Crawford, and the doors swung open silently, and Danny stepped into a chamber that took his breath away. The throne room was circular with a domed ceiling that showed the stars beyond, and the walls were made of crystal that seemed to pulse with inner light, and at the far end of the room sat Princess Liana on a throne that appeared to be carved from a single massive gemstone. Danny's first thought was that she had not aged a day, and her silver eyes still glowed with that same otherworldly light, and her pointed ears still caught every sound, and her skin still shimmered like moonlight. And then he remembered that Celestari lived for centuries and 14 years was nothing to them. But what made him stop walking were the two dragons coiled around the base of her throne, and Ember had grown larger, and her crimson scales now gleamed like polished rubies, and Frost's ice-blue form seemed to fill half the room, and both dragons raised their heads and fixed their ancient eyes on the human who had returned. Princess Lyanna stood and descended from her throne, and her robes flowed around her like liquid starlight, and she walked across the chamber until she stood directly in front of Dani, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dani remembered the protocol from his childhood, and he knelt on one knee and bowed his head, and spoke the formal greeting in the Celestari language that his father had taught him, and he requested permission to address the throne. Lyanna smiled slightly and told him to rise, and she asked how his journey had been, and Dani stood and said it had been long but peaceful, and he had much to tell her about the past 14 years. The princess gestured toward a smaller chamber off to the side, and they walked together, while both dragons followed, and Ember made a soft chirping sound that Dani recognized as greeting, and he reached out to touch her scales as they had when he was young. Inside the private chamber, comfortable seats were arranged around a low table, and Lyanna invited Dani to sit, and a servant brought refreshments and then left them alone with the dragons, and Frost settled on the floor, while Ember curled up near Dani's feet. Princess Lyanna looked at Dani with those piercing silver eyes and asked him to tell her about his experiences since leaving Celestara. And Dani took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her everything, and he spoke about the first desperate year when he had barely survived, and the cheating merchant on Vega Station, and the crime syndicate on Tarkos that had sabotaged his ship, and he described meeting Carl Hayes and learning advanced trading techniques and building his first real crew. Dani talked about Viridian 4 and the medical supplies, and staying to help sick colonists, and he mentioned the smuggling ring he had exposed and the business he had lost because of it. And he explained how he had chosen crew members based on character rather than just skill. He spoke honestly about his failures and the cargo lost to fraud and the navigation error that injured crew members and the contracts he had refused that might have made him wealthy, but would have compromised his values, and he admitted that sometimes he questioned whether he was too idealistic. Princess Lyanna listened without interrupting, and her expression remained neutral, though occasionally her eyes would shift to one of the dragons as if silently communicating, and Ember's tail would twitch, or Frost would hum softly, but neither dragon made any other sound. When Dani finished speaking, he looked directly at the princess and said that he had come not to claim his father's fortune, but to know her judgment, and if she decided he was not worthy, then he would accept that decision and leave, and the fortune could be donated to charitable causes or disposed of, however she saw fit. For a long moment, Princess Lyanna said nothing, and she simply studied Dani's face as if reading something written there in invisible ink, and then she stood and walked to a crystal panel on the wall and touched it with one elegant hand. The panel glowed, and images appeared showing records from the past 14 years, and reports from her information network, and testimony from people Dani had helped, and complaints from those he had opposed, and financial records and crew evaluations and station master reviews. Dani watched in amazement as Princess Lyanna scrolled through what must have been thousands of documents, and she had been watching him the entire time, and tracking every decision and recording every success and failure and building a complete picture of who he had become. Finally, the princess turned from the display, and her silver eyes held an emotion that Dani could not quite identify, and she told him that his father would have been proud, and Richard Crawford had asked her to judge whether his son had become a man of honor and integrity, and her judgment was clear. Dani Crawford had proven himself worthy. The vault doors opened with a sound like distant thunder, and Princess Lyanna led Dani Crawford down ancient stairs carved into the crystal foundations of her palace, and Ember and Frost followed close behind, and their presence filled the narrow passage with warmth and cold that somehow balanced each other perfectly. Dani's heart pounded as they descended, and he had expected to feel excitement at finally claiming his father's fortune, but instead he felt a strange reluctance, and the wealth waiting below represented the end of a chapter in his life, and once he accepted it, everything would change. The vault chamber was circular with walls that glowed from within, and in the center stood a series of secured containers, each marked with the Crawford family seal, and Princess Leanna walked to the main console and placed her hand on the biometric scanner, and the locks disengaged with soft clicks. She turned to Danny and explained that his father had left 3 cargo ships and investments in 4 mining operations and accounts holding substantial credits, and over 14 years, she had managed these assets carefully, and the original fortune had grown significantly through wise investments and careful oversight. The princess pulled up financial displays that showed the current value of the Crawford estate, and Danny stared at the numbers in shock, and the amount was far larger than he had imagined, and it was enough to expand his fleet tenfold or retire in comfort on any planet. He chose or fund charitable operations across multiple sectors. Leanna handed him data cards containing all the account access codes and transfer authorizations and ownership documents, and she told him that everything was his without restriction or condition, and her duty as guardian was fulfilled, and she had kept her promise to his father. Danny took the data cards, but he did not look at them, and instead, he looked at Princess Leanna and asked if she remembered what he had said in the private chamber, and he had come not seeking the fortune but seeking her judgment, and now that he had received that judgment, he needed to say something. The princess tilted her head slightly, and her silver eyes reflected curiosity, and she told him to speak freely. And Danny took a deep breath and tried to find words for feelings he had carried for years. He explained that during his 14 years away, he had thought about Celestara constantly, and every difficult decision had been made with the question of what Princess Leanna would think if she knew. And every time he chose honor over profit, he imagined reporting that choice to her, and every success felt incomplete because he could not share it with her. Danny said that somewhere during those years his goal had shifted, and he had stopped trying to become worthy of his father's fortune and started trying to become worthy of her, and not just her respect as a guardian, but something deeper that he had been afraid to acknowledge. The words came out awkwardly, and Danny had commanded ships through dangerous space and negotiated with hardened traitors and faced down criminals, but confessing his feelings to an ancient elf princess made him feel like that 12-year-old boy again. Princess Leanna remained silent, and her expression was unreadable, and Ember made a soft chirping sound while Frost's tail moved in what might have been approval or amusement, and Danny forced himself to continue. He told her that the fortune meant nothing if he could not share his life with her, and he understood that she was royalty and he was just a human trader, and she had lived for centuries, while he would barely live one, and their worlds were completely different. But he had to tell her the truth before he left. Danny said that if she wanted him to go, he would accept the fortune and depart Celestara and never return, and he would build a good life and honor his father's memory and try to forget that his heart had chosen someone impossible, but if there was any chance that she might feel something similar, then he wanted to stay. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, and Princess Leanna stood perfectly still, and her silver eyes never left Danny's face. And finally she spoke in a voice that carried emotions he had never heard from her before. She told him that Celestari were taught to guard their hearts carefully, and their long lives meant they watched countless shorter-lived species come and go, and forming attachments to beings who would die in what felt like moments was considered unwise and painful. And yet she had been watching Danny Crawford for 14 years. Leanna explained that she had received daily reports about his activities, and she had read every document and tracked every decision, and she had felt pride when he succeeded, and worry when he struggled, and anger when others tried to harm him. And somewhere during those years, her duty as guardian had become something else. The princess admitted that other suitors had approached her during the 14 years, and powerful alien lords had offered political alliances, and wealthy merchants had promised to expand her influence, and military commanders had pledged their fleets, but she had refused them all, and her advisors had questioned her decisions. She told Danny that when she learned he was finally returning to Celestara, she had felt a nervousness she had not experienced in centuries, and she had changed her robes 3 times before settling on the current ones, and she had rehearsed what she would say, and Ember and Frost had laughed at her obvious anxiety. Leanna said that she had lived for over 800 years, and in all that time, she had never met anyone quite like Danny Crawford, and his father had been a good man. But the son had become something remarkable, and not because of wealth or success, but because of who he chose to be when faced with difficult decisions. The princess stepped closer until she stood directly in front of Danny, and she reached up and touched the crystal pendant that still hung around his neck and the communication stone she had given him 14 years ago, and she asked if he knew that she could sense his emotions through the stone. Danny shook his head in surprise, and Liana smiled and said that the stone was connected to her, and whenever he had been afraid or sad or triumphant, she had felt echoes of those emotions, and the bond had grown stronger over time until she could sense him even across vast distances. She told him that Celestari bonding was complex, and their long lives meant they chose partners very carefully, but when they did choose, the bond was permanent and deep, and she was offering him that choice if he wanted it, and not as a guardian to her ward, but as equals. Danny felt like his heart might burst from his chest, and he asked what bonding meant exactly, and Princess Liana explained that their life forces would connect and he would gain extended lifespan, though not as long as hers, and they would share thoughts and emotions, and neither would be complete without the other. She warned him that it was not a decision to make lightly, and once bonded they could never truly separate, and even death would not completely break the connection, and he would be giving up the chance for a normal human life, and he would be tied to Celestara and its responsibilities. Danny laughed and said that he had not had a normal life since he was 12 years old, and he had spent 14 years trying to become worthy of her. And now that she was offering him everything he wanted, he would be a fool to refuse. Ember suddenly jumped up and released a stream of celebratory fire that scorched the vault ceiling, and frost roared so loudly that the crystal walls vibrated, and both dragons began circling Danny and Liana while making joyful sounds. Princess Liana smiled more widely than Danny had ever seen, and she took his hands in hers, and her skin felt warm and electric, and she told him that the bonding ceremony would take 3 days and require the participation of both dragons. And afterwards, he would be recognized as Prince Consort of Celestara. Danny said he did not care about titles and he just wanted to be with her, and Liana laughed and said that was exactly the right answer. And then she did something that surprised him, and she leaned forward and kissed him, and it was nothing like he imagined, and it was better. When they finally separated, Ember was dancing in circles and Frost was humming a melody that sounded like ancient music, and Princess Liana looked at Danny with silver eyes that glowed brighter than ever and told him, "Welcome home." Danny realized that the fortune in the vault behind them was no longer the most valuable thing in the room, and his father had given him wealth, but Princess Liana was giving him something far more precious, and a purpose, and a partner, and a future that extended beyond anything he had imagined. They climbed the stairs together with dragons following, and Danny knew he would need to return to his ship and explain to his crew what was happening and figure out how to integrate his trading business with his new role and handle countless practical details. But for now he just walked beside Princess Liana through the crystal corridors of her palace, and their hands were clasped together, and 14 years of waiting had finally led to this moment, and Richard Crawford's final wish had been fulfilled in ways he could never have predicted. The 3 moons of Celestara shone through the palace windows and cast silver light across the halls, and somewhere in the distance, dragons sang their joy, and a human trader who had become worthy of a princess's love smiled and knew that he was finally home.